if just feel free to raise your hand, everybody, if you'd like me to adjust anything. Again, I'm delighted to be here. Development is something that is so important. And I know your professor and myself have over the years worked on this topic. And therefore, I was really grateful and excited to be able to join you from Nairobi. And I do hope that what I'm going to discuss with you is going to be of benefit and will offer you maybe some insights from this part of the world that might complement what you already have. Maybe there will be similarities, maybe differences. So I'm going to offer you a discussion, not necessarily a lecture. And therefore, if you'd like to ask or clarification questions, just let me see if I can see your hand up, and we can have a conversation. So feel free to interject. So I will go through the slides and try and explain some of the concepts, lay out the agenda for today and for the class next Friday and the Friday after. And then I shall get into a more discussion about today's work. So broadly, what you're seeing on the screen right now are the areas that one might want to discuss if they discuss development. And this conceptual topics or highlights, these broad themes, are not something I will talk about directly one after the other. That is not my agenda. My agenda is to weave these concepts into my discussion, because these are very broad concepts, and it wouldn't be each any one of these could be a course on its own. So what I decided to do was to take these themes and see how they fit into the Kenyan or African perspective. The advantage there is that then you get new information from what are baseline topics that you probably already know about. The disadvantage is that it might feel as if we have still left a lot on the table that needs to be discussed, and therefore we can talk about that later on. So we are talking about contemporary issues of development. And from that topic, it seems to me that there are certain things to take for granted, and now we just want to elevate some of the more serious issues. However, what we know about development up to this point is that there are international organizations that talk and deal with the question of development, and those in the legal academy are invested in understanding and questioning how these international organizations, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, how they work, and whether they are enhancing development or not. Then we do have this, the regime that's established under the United Nations, where states, sovereign states, are participants in trade and investment treaties, the development of those as an item that is important to think about if you're going to think about development. Then, of course, you have regional and national country roles, political arrangements, economic arrangements, monetary arrangements that are also key in thinking about development. However, we may not necessarily say, okay, that there's a role for Africa or there's a Kenyan role. There might be, but what we are also asking is, when you have the EU and the US and China in some kind of competition for resources in the world, how does Africa get affected by that? So in other words, you could not say that if you're talking about international development and the only thing you're going to talk about is the EU, a broader perspective is demanded. You cannot just talk of China because China exists in this global system of trade, extraction of resources, and so on, investment. And there will be conflicts, which take us back to something like the WTO and how it handles the conflicts that emerge from those arrangements, or something like the IMF, how it will handle currency fluctuations or currency problems, and how does that affect countries such as Kenya and also other African countries. Now, it's no longer just an affair about the states, it also involves multinational corporations, and those are usually, fronted by their own home countries for purposes of investing in African contexts. How does that private engagement differ from the other kind of development questions we ask, such as, donor aid, such as loans and grants? What do multinational corporations add to this complex scenario? So what I want to do, taking all this into account, is to see, can we narrow this into an understanding of the Kenyan or the African perspective? And that's what my goal would be in the next 3 sessions that we are going to be talking about this. And therefore, in this session today, I just want to lay out the significance of what difference does it make how we think about development? What difference does it make how we think about development? And I would like to look at about 7 areas of contemporary questions about how we are thinking about development. The last one there is, what are the hindrances or the impediments to development, session 1.7. Then next week, I would like to go into the more technical details of development finance. So how to raise the money and what are the issues that arise there. How the money is spent, what are the issues in spending money raised for development, and the issues of trade investment and currency stabilization that arise as questions of the international monetary system. And then in our last session, it's where I would like to talk about progress that has been made, areas that we are not progressing that pose challenge, but more importantly, the new things that are coming up, or the new questions that have come up, namely emergency finance, the problem of sovereign debt, and the African trade treaty, and whether it's going, and how it's expected to work and answer the questions that we're raising with regards to development. So today is just session 1. How are we going to think about development, and what difference does it make? So, thinking about development, let us start there. Because I do think that it really matters how you're thinking about development, even before you talk about the international development framework and the institutions that govern, that drive it, or in which development is driven. So, if you're thinking about development in the African context, you're going to encounter a familiar narrative that starts with problems and ends with solutions. So this familiar narrative is as follows. It starts at the point where there is some kind of interaction between locals and foreigners. And that interaction, and it goes back many centuries. We only talk about colonization as a period of intense engagement with Africa between European nations and Africa. But even beyond that, before that, there was trade. Before that, there was slave trade. Before that, there was extraction of resources, spices. There were systems by which currency was not modern currency, but traditional currency was developed to facilitate exchange. There was engagement. There were actually wealthy African kingdoms before 19th, 20th century. There was construction, there were things going on before that. But we are talking of this narrative that starts with there is a point of contact that justifies commencement of international engagements, even formation of treaties. That point of contact leads to the next question, which is either through experts or anthropologists or scientists or traders, maybe governors, maybe tribal chiefs. There will be a serious problem that is identified, which provides a justification for studying the problem and presenting a solution. So development, as we conceptualize it today, is an international problem because it starts with international engagements. That is its resting place. But then you have to give me a problem. It may be that there's syphilis that's out of control. Yeah, I mean the disease. And now we must find a solution for it because it has been introduced through external contact and the local populations are not familiar, their immune systems are not able to overcome that kind of introduction of this problem. It could be any other problem. Maybe right now, for us in Africa, we are thinking the point of interaction is climate change, where Africa contributes the lowest levels of pollution. I think it's about 3% of global pollution comes from Africa. But then we are having to deal with it because we are going to have to face the consequences. And now that's a development problem. We must conceptualize what the solution is going to be. Now, the typical response is point number 3. The solution is typically found from international sources. And these solutions might be within reformation and creation of domestic institutions or international law and institutions. And we shall unpack this later on. But I want you to see how it all starts and how it goes. Now, predictably, the solutions from international sources do not work that well, which then leads to questions about, could we look to domestic sources for solutions? So international discourse, development discourse has this dual characteristic. It has this binary between the efficacy of international solutions and the possibility of local solutions. Okay. So ultimately, you might have a hybrid response because you have international and domestic response trying to compete for this narrative of providing the solution. And in any event, You may have an international conference that crafts what the intervention is going to be. But when you bring that solution from that international conference, even from Glasgow, Scotland today, when it comes back, it will still have to encounter domestic questions. And therefore, there will be something in terms of getting this familiar narrative play out all over again. So we've talked about international responses. So if you think of colonization of Africa, decolonization, development agenda of the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the WTO, again, there is some way we have come accustomed to thinking about development, and we look at this as the solutions. So Africa, Kenya is underdeveloped. What is the solution? So somebody thought, and this is something I'll touch on with the assumption that you already understand some of the information that's involved here, that the solution is you're coming from a context of need. And I will tell you what the needs are in a bit. There just isn't some way that these nations in the developing world have the skills, have the infrastructure, have the knowledge to solve development problems. And it could be a range of development problems, including just the question of productivity. Is there enough productivity? But also the question of, is there enough ability to sustain life, to ensure people are not dying of famine, to ensure that people are not dying of disease, to ensure that land is properly utilized. And because you do not have this inherent domestic ability, and maybe that is a narrative that international development law has created, then the solution is state-led development. You don't have industries, there's no industrialization, and you don't have the investor to start the industry. You don't have the scientific knowledge. You don't have Albert Einstein to start some magical scientific solution to a big problem. You just don't have it. So who's going to do that? So the solution from international response is, let us finance the state, and the state will start all these factories, the state will start extracting, the state will own the resources, all right? The state will own most of the resources, so state-led development. And that will enable then the state to produce things that these poor nations can use in international trade and therefore earn foreign currency. But that's one idea. So the second idea, which I'm sure you're well familiar with, is you have markets. Markets as a counter to state-led development. Let the people, or let the investors bring about development. Just provide private property, no excess of property held by the state. Just provide, allow for contracts and the whole system of contracts enforcement, from determining what constitutes a valid contract to expeditious dispute resolution to rule of law reform. Create these institutions, and for private property, ensure there is real estate finance and banking. And related to the two of them, then you can think, okay, those are things one could do in order to, maybe development for you is raising their standard of living. These things will come out of this international response. So the state has a role, but it shouldn't have a dominant role in advancing trade. However, even if you were to adopt a state-led development agenda, you would be having state-organized and financed entities that are producing for export. And that's where you create industrial development, manufacturing, agricultural, extractive, all that is either market or state. And however, because this is a deprived country, you have to import a lot of the supplies and the equipment. So that's one area you can debate. Should it be state or should it be market, trade, all right? What is the role of these institutions? The other part is finance. Should finance be state-led or should finance be private market led? Okay, so you will see that it's both. And maybe the question for us in discussing development is asking what kind of financing should be state financing and what kind of financing should be about a market. What kind, how much can you borrow if you do not have the promise of a strong tax base? How will you repay your debts if you are not taxing your citizens because you do not have the economic, a strong economy from which to extract taxation? Okay, so the role of the state there becomes a huge question, and the risk of debt finance becomes also huge. So what answer are you going to have? Is it foreign direct investment? Because the state cannot do it. Then you probably then have to go back to market institutions where you promote the legal framework to allow for foreign direct investment from which then development can take place. Okay, and therefore point number 5 is also important because you're going to be talking about the efficacy of dispute resolution, not domestically, yes, but internationally. Okay, so domestic and international arbitration. International, why? Because if now you cannot have a state that has a good tax base, you must have a foreign investor. That foreign investor must have the assurance, the protection of their investment. That assurance can come if they can go to international arbitration. Moreover, you also want to be sure that there is reciprocal enforcement of judicial decisions. All right, so we are still on the narrative, and I want to go to the next slide and talk about another kind of response. We have said there's local international interaction. There is a problem. This problem requires solutions. The first impulse is to get solutions internationally. And one set of solutions involves creating these institutions, market institutions, making sure of figuring out how trade can take off, right? How industry can take off, how there can be finance, either market-based finance or state finance. How can there be efficient dispute resolution? Now, the other set of responses has to do with, and I know I was informed that you are doing the international relations master's degree. So forgive me if my bias is too legal because I am in the legal field, but I'm sure these are not very far from where you are. Okay, so how are you going to do this? I want you to imagine a situation where that initial interaction between Africans and the outside world, whether European, whether Chinese, whether whoever, whether American, assumes, take as an assumption that you do not have viable states in Africa. The political organization of a state is not there. You're having to build the state yourself, either as a colonial power or as a post-colonial system that is trying to fit into the global uh, order that only engages with state. Only a state can conclude a trade treaty. So you're going to need, or the response that international regime gives is, you need to create this state. And this state must have the capacity to allow markets to work, private property to be owned, trade investments to be protected, finance to be raised, credit to be ascertained and risk managed. You do not have that. And therefore, the thing that is to bring that about, in addition, to the politics, and you have elections, and you have a national assembly, you have courts, you have the president, and you have everybody. You must now think about how will the markets work, and you need a legal system that works. And therefore, I have divided this process of, call it state formation. So the international response is, there can be no response to development problems if you do not have working states. So create the state. State formation starts with laws, and the laws in the first instance are market supportive laws, democratization laws, because that's a predicate of the international legal system. So you may have heard of the rule of law and good governance regimes that are prescribed by the World Bank. And then there is human rights, which would have been prescribed either by domestic institutions or by other actors. For instance, the State Department of a particular country might insist that it will only finance development in a particular country if human rights laws are in place. So we are creating the state here. We are creating some way by which we have liberal democracy, we have liberal markets, right? We have the political side of development in place. We shall see later on that law reform number 1 does the bare minimum. And it's not very clear whether it actually even attracts those foreign investors. Because remember, we said there is no state, there is no tax base. So even if the state itself was to borrow, you would not have a tax base from which to repay those debts. So you either just leave it all to some market forces and encourage foreign direct investment, or you have private-public partnership where the state-led growth, where the state is itself a market actor, so to speak, and is involved in trade and ownership of resources and so on. That doesn't seem to work well. It doesn't seem to answer the development problem that you set out to solve. And therefore, it ushers in a second wave of reform. And that's what I'm calling law reform number 2. So it is felt as if that law reform number 1 only succeeds in making sure that the colonial system of extracting from Africa continues. That despite all the wealth, mineral wealth, natural resources, human resources, that African countries continue to be poor despite, creating markets and so on. That a lot of the resources are extracted with little benefit to the local communities. And if that is not solved, and of course there's corruption, and therefore whatever benefits that law reform 1 would have brought about really doesn't work that well, because a lot of what happens is serious wealth inequality. Why? Because the elites for whom this state was created. Remember, we created a state that should cause development to happen. The elites scream, of course, collaborating with their international friends, maybe take all the money and send it back abroad instead of investing it locally. Okay, so there's that problem. Law Reform 1 just doesn't do it. State-led development bankrupts everything. No state enterprise survives. They all are on their knees for some, and they need to be rescued. And they are bottomless pits of money. Every time, it's like the airline industry, every time you put money in it, it needs more money. So it's not working very well. And in the meantime, there is social unrest. There is serious environmental degradation. There is serious wealth inequality because you have natural resources, and we can see, the common person can see the elites are living really well, but the common person doesn't, it's not getting, the promise of trickle down doesn't just get down. It never gets down, right? Never gets down at all. So we go to law reform number 2. And this is where we probably are at the moment, and also on the way to law reform number 3. So law reform number 2 is a homegrown struggle for better distribution of resources. Okay, so you will have in our laws provisions that say, even if you're a foreign direct investor who is extracting minerals, you have an obligation to make sure that village where you have set up has a school, has a hospital. You are not bringing workers from outside the country. You're trying to make sure that you're employing local people in your factories or in your mines. Enhanced employment laws, yeah, so that the miners are protected better. And here we can begin to see this puzzle, or how we come to the sustainable development goals of alleviating poverty, ensuring health, education, protecting the environment, and so on, all the 17 of them. But also importantly is because the moment of law reform 1 is a moment of failure. We the citizens in African countries cannot trust the government. The government has totally sold out. Despite all the reforms, or if there was ever privatization of land, all that land ended up in very few hands, the hands of the ruling class. So total failure of trust. And there's a sense on the ground that the problem is that local elites are collaborating with international investors. They're collaborating in order to sell out, in order not to protect the African on the ground. What is the solution to that? So in this moment of law reform 2, there are more controls as to how an African nation that is going through reform can conclude treaties. How many levels of clearance it must go through? Because before, you just sign off to the foreign direct investor, whatever the foreign direct investor wants. If they want to do a secret contract, they do. And we have had a lot of secret contracts concluded even between Kenya and the Chinese government for infrastructure development, or for building the railways, or giving away the port of Mombasa as collateral if Kenya is unable to pay the Chinese debt, all in secrecy, no scrutiny. So the moment of law reform 2 is to answer that problem. Why we said in law reform 1, we are democratized. But we continue to see secret contracts. They're taking away of resources, even massive theft of resources, so that the foreign investor is only paying very little of what they actually get out. So there's a lot of secrecy as to what are they actually getting out, and so on and so forth. So part of law reform one is to increase international accountability. So there's more boldness in questioning the decisions of the World Bank and the IMF and any other, state department of foreign affairs that make a decision that affects local people. Then they have tried to open up more instances where they can question those decisions. Now, law reform 3 is what I would like to contrast with law reform 1 and 2. Okay, so this is an interesting moment for another reason. Remember, we started by, we don't have functioning states in Africa. We are coming from a colonial context. African enterprise, ingenuity, creativity was not allowed to thrive in that context. But all of a sudden, the colonizer has left. Oops, nobody has the skills to do anything. So it's a crisis because you can't raise money, you can't raise finance, you don't have factories, you don't have industries. How are you going to proceed with development? What's happening in Law Reform 3 is a sort of a different moment in the sense that it does not need the state that much. The state now is a smaller player. Nobody really needs to spend huge amounts of resources to create a state bureaucracy. Why? Because this is a digital moment. Any young kid, you could say, who is able to get up by themselves, even with not that much by way of state support, can still make an income online. The state is going to be catching up with them, trying to figure out how do we tax these people, right? How do we regulate them in case what they are doing is illegal? If they are earning, it's like the Bitcoin moment, and Bitcoin is also big here in Kenya, a cryptocurrency. The state is so stuck in law reform 1 and law reform 2, they have no idea how to deal with this new generation that is very digital savvy, huge unemployment rate, and therefore taking advantage of this digital space to try and make a living for themselves. So Kenya has been a case study for fintech, for the advance of the e-commerce that is quite unregulated because the state has not yet caught up with it. And even as I'm calling it law reform 3, it's not that we have the laws yet. People are still trying to figure out what kind of laws are we going to have for this particular digital period that is able to circumvent or seem to circumvent and go around the state. However, the state is trying to get into the digital season as well through interventions such as we had a huge crisis not too long ago, where the Kenyan state tried to make everybody get a digital ID that including DNA, collect your DNA, collect your GPS coordinates, collect your fingerprints, collect your whatever you do with the eyes, so that there's facial identity markers, and collect all that for all the citizens, because the state is itching to go into the digital economy and it has no way of knowing who's where. They want to create smart cities, but you can't run a transport system without digital IDs. But the citizens have refused to take digital IDs. So it goes to court, and it's a back and forth, only to demonstrate that this is the third moment of development response that we are having. I could add others, such as diaspora remittances and so on. There's problems of climate change that need to be responded to. But I will move on and leave you with that. So in this, and please continue to let me know if you'd like to ask a question. But if we're moving on in this thinking about development from problems to solutions, we can highlight the following gaps and they'll become clearer as we go along. So we have the problems and we have the international solutions. I'm not saying it's always clear that a problem has been clearly articulated and a solution has been clearly articulated. It's never that clear, but we can talk about it in general terms. So we said that there was going to be creating a state that creates a resource base, and that resource base is the basis for foreign or some kind of domestic, maybe state investment, and that spurs trade activity, and that trade activity in turn helps the country to, to be, maybe get foreign exchange into the country, which it will need maybe to pay debts and so on. But it doesn't go that well, as I have noted. There are problems with creating this state and running it and creating the markets. And some of the problems come from that process of privatization. I took you to a point where the narrative is Africa doesn't have states. I want to take you to another narrative, and that narrative is Africa doesn't have
It's 17 hours.
a private system. Africans live in a communal world. They have not privatized. And without privatization, you cannot have market exchange. If everything is owned by everybody, then what are you going to exchange with anybody? I'm saying this is a narrative. I'm not saying that's the reality. So the first point of making the state and the market work is to start programs of privatization, okay? So land. But privatization of land leads to a lot of displacement and disinheritance. It disturbs whatever it is that the international system does not see, which is a system that has been there for centuries, that assures land is available to women, to indigenous communities, and even to strangers. The same system that assured, that enabled colonization to happen because it was possible to allow foreigners to settle on African lands. Of course, the story ended up very badly, but African communities were open to settlement by newcomers. But privatization stops that, right? So newcomers have to go through a state bureaucracy. Remember, we created a bureaucracy. And the process of exchange involves banking institutions, markets. Remember, we also said we have unskilled populations. How do they use these bureaucracies? Women, for one, are not able to use these bureaucracies. Why? Because for a long time, women are not allowed to go to school, as an example. But the people who are formulating these solutions, sitting at the World Bank, the IMF, took a very long time to understand that you don't just say, I'm creating a state, I'm creating a market, I'm going to privatize all the land, I'm going to privatize all the minerals. and expect that development will just happen. In fact, the opposite happens. Women become impoverished. And when you impoverish women, it means children also suffer. So you have low rates for maybe children going to school. You have high infant mortality rates. Everything that is not development begins to happen, even if you started by saying that you are in pursuit of development. You let loose the local communities on state corporations, state entities, or even private ones that are just full of speculators. They do not get the land for the purpose of providing development, but just to speculate because it's capitalism. So they take advantage of that and they leave local communities still underdeveloped. What is the other gap? Another gap is the power of this state we have created to do eminent domain. Why does it need to do eminent domain, which is the taking of land for public use? Because we have defined development as being able to end up in a trade system in the global regime. Therefore, there must be infrastructure to transport what the investor has done, if they're growing coffee, if they are mining, if they are doing other production, you need infrastructure. And therefore, this state does infrastructure development to advance that trade, however, leading to a lot of displacement, evictions, environmental degradation, and benefits to government officials, and great suffering for local communities. That is the part of privatization. I highlight only 3 instances where we have problems coming now from the privatization process. The second problem with privatization, with how we are thinking about development, is the effects of foreign investment and trade, the effects on local populations, the effects on the environment, and then later on we shall talk about whether there is any benefit to foreign investment and trade. If the foreign investor is told, come in, but they're given serious tax waivers, what was the foreign investor doing other than changing their location? Because then with these tax waivers and preferential treatment, which are in the treaties for investment, and a huge leak in the system, so that even if there was smuggling of gold, smuggling of natural resources, taking the wildlife without maybe even harvesting fish from the maritime areas, there's no good system to prevent that from happening. So what was the benefit of international foreign investment and trade? Questions have to be asked there. Then the effects of debt. This would be familiar to you because I think almost every country in the world must deal with the problem of debt. But in the African context, it is a really, really serious problem. Okay, so with part of the reform processes that I have highlighted earlier, you have austerity measures to curb the problem of debt, to make sure that the elite in government are actually using resources for public ends and are actually repaying debts. Because if you don't repay debt, in international discussion, we are going to say that you are defaulting. And if you are defaulting, there are consequences to sovereign debt default, including you cannot, get including inflation, you cannot get good credit scores with the credit rating agencies and so on. Okay, fair enough. That is the argument that the IMF and the World Bank will make. But these austerity measures lead to endemic poverty and inequality. Therefore, more work needs to be done in terms of conceptualizing development problems to solutions. How do you deal with the problem of debt? Similarly, rule of law and good governance, we already mentioned, they do not protect the vulnerable people. They end up protecting the international investors. They are the ones now who have the private property we were talking about, the right to enforce contracts at international dispute resolution tribunals. That is what good governance and rule of law means. But what about the person who has been displaced from their property, ancestral lands, community lands? And what about the child who must, endure pollution from industrial production, and they have no way to redress the sickness? And it may not be one child, it could be many children. And then the loss of sovereign authority, because the failure of the African state is well documented, but it also means that very low bargaining power when it comes to negotiating at the international platform. And when a country is in debt, you would have known this from Greece, it loses a lot of sovereign authority, a lot of the things that will happen to it domestically, some of the decisions that must be made domestically are not a symbol of strong sovereignty. It's a serious loss of sovereign authority. For the African context, the African people are already subjugated. They are already in a hard place. To see them in a state of loss of state sovereignty also creates a lot of legitimacy problems. And finally, the limits on human rights is that human rights are conceived as being political rights, and this ignores economic impact and the impact of economic policy making, which is a market question. So we are reforming the state, we are creating an African state, but then we also want a market system, which we are also creating. Remember, we started by creating those ones. But is there an opportunity to talk about human rights on the market side of this discussion? Or human rights are only on this is authoritarian regime and it is doing horrible things to its people? Can human rights be more fluid to go to discussions about state authority, but also about market power? And similarly, we must go to areas about, the healthcare systems. Are they working? How do we ensure that happens? When you're caught between universal healthcare on the one hand and a purely private healthcare system, is a human rights framework helpful in terms of opening that up, that dilemma that leaves a lot of people vulnerable, and many end up dying or having the very lives that we would not say would occur with development. The same goes with the education system. So if you're going to pick two things that are emblematic of development, healthcare and education systems, it would seem that the international responses that we created earlier on, or that were created earlier on, have not responded to how can you have good and effective healthcare systems? How can you have good and effective educational system? Okay. So the international responses haven't worked very well. We look at the local responses. Because in the end we said, even if you were to come with a white paper from Washington, DC, from Brussels or some other place, and say this is going to be good for Africa, you will find that you probably will need to make certain local encounters and adjustments. And this is a summary of some of the ideas that you might, that have worked or played out in this regard. Now, on the question of creating markets, there was this assumption that Africa doesn't have states. Africa doesn't have private property or even any notion of private, right? And who says this? Maybe it's a local colonial governor, maybe it is the anthropologist who has carried out a study in an African village, maybe it's a local chief. Solution from the international perspective: create a state because you have a need for a state, create a market, a private economy because you have a need for that. But what does that say? It says all these African communities that didn't have those things are outside your framework. Now you will be trying to take them to school, to do what, to educate them so that they can begin to participate in the state and market system that you have created as an international agent or body institution. But you do that for a decade, 2, 3 decades, and poverty remains. No development is taking off. If anything, now your foreign direct investors have begun to leave the countries. Why? Because since you didn't solve the development question, you have a lot of conflict and they cannot operate as foreign direct investors in a conflict area. So they leave. So you have not achieved much. So it's at that point people begin to reflect. Should we be changing how we think about markets? And should we try and recover some of the ideas of the informal economy? So that's one instance. So you cannot wholly ignore the informal economy. And by informal, I mean that economic activity that takes place outside the control of the state, outside the infrastructure of the state, outside the support of the state. It is just organic in itself. It goes on. It was there before the state and continues to in the shadow of the state. Not just trade, even dispute resolution. Not, you may come with a nice blueprint about how you're going to have formal courts everywhere, but it doesn't really happen that way. People might refuse to go to those formal courts and say, we will not go to that court because we don't trust it. So you have empty courts. Nobody is participating in it. Why? Because you have an informal system of dispute resolution. It may not work for your foreign investor who may have a lot of, written contracts, a lot at stake, but it works for the ordinary guy who's living their ordinary life. So searching for local responses has entailed going to ask, how can we link conflict and development? If we allow informal systems of dispute resolution, there will be no conflict. And when you eliminate conflict, then maybe you have a chance to have foreign direct investment. So similarly, how is the informal economy working? And what is interesting then is that financial technology or the digital economy is an example of an informal economy because the state is not able to penetrate it that well. And therefore, for countries that do not have very good infrastructure, digital works so well. It works very well. People can do digital banking. They do not need actual banks. So there's no need to invest in building a whole bank that takes a lot of land and people have to go to it physically. People will do their trade just using their cell phones. And that is huge in Kenya, in Nigeria, in South Africa. That is the alternative to the state system. Then what has also happened is you have more restrictions on land tenure reforms so that it is not all fully based. We shall see later on there are protections, for community land. Remember at the beginning, the idea was, oh, Africa has a problem because it doesn't have any private land, privatize everything. So there's a pushback on that, and much more is being left under the hands of communities, not even the state, just communities, groups, women's groups, empowering some kind of corporate family-based activity that was not that well recognized by the market regimes. So that's how you will have a corporate law system that recognizes small and micro enterprises and family-owned corporations as a local solution to the development gaps that might exist, whose solution was not that well provided for by the international response. Then you have requirements that giving the communities some control over natural resources and how the profit is shared, so that it is not all extracting and leaving no resources for the local communities to also develop. So it's profit sharing clauses in the international contracts that a foreign investor is going to have. And of course, a more closer look at environmental regulation to prevent damage to the extensive damage to the environment in the name of profit. On trade and industry, there is, you see, if you want to have a foreign investor as your solution to development, and you tell that foreign investor, build your factory in my country, and they say, yes, I will do that, but I want to be able to bring in this number of employees. I want to be able to use material and to import material that I need for this industry. And if I import that material, you need to remove the taxation or the duty on that material and so on. And you have this elaborate trade and industry contract. It looks good because you have succeeded in convincing the foreign direct investor to come to you. But they will import everything tax-free. And what will happen to the local material, which likely is still being taxed by the same state? So that it looks like the foreign investor actually succeeds in depressing local sources of material. So local content laws require the foreign investor to use a certain, maybe I think it's 30% of local material in their production activity, excluding water, because water, they must use local water anyway. They're not going to import water. But, things like, local stones or local timber or local, whatever local thing that can be supplied. Maybe they have to order parts from local manufacturers to meet their 30% requirement of local content. That then allows the local manufacturers also to participate in that trade and industry, because they may not be able to themselves export whatever small goods they are producing. So that when you go to the supermarket and you see a knife, just a knife that you use to cut bread, and it is manufactured locally, you are not seeing that the whole thing is produced using foreign material, like Chinese. Maybe the Chinese is a favorite for us because we have a lot of Chinese industry, but at least maybe the handle of the knife has come from a local person, and then that is the 30%, and then the rest can be from an imported material and so on. Same with a bicycle. Maybe the seat of the bicycle must have some local contribution. So that's local content as a local response to these issues. Later on in session number 3, we are going to talk about now international law responses that have a local dimension, such as, the African Continental Trade Agreement. Is that a local response to not, having a continent-wide agreement? Then treaty ratification regulations. Is that a local response to check the power of governments to sign any, trade investment treaty without taking into consideration local voices, protection of local environments and forests, and so on? Third, as an international local response, giving local governments or African governments the right to revoke treaties if they are signed under conditions that are exploitative to African contexts. And later on, we shall also look at domestication of social and economic rights, domestication of sustainable development goals, and international dispute resolution mechanisms.